For 2 years, Caitlin Clark absorbed hits that went uncalled while the league that benefited most from her presence looked the other way. The numbers, the contracts, and the officiating record now tell a clearer story than the league's public messaging ever did. WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert did not come from a basketball background. She built her career in corporate accounting at Deloitte, an environment where an overconcentration of value in a single asset is treated as institutional risk. When Clark arrived and immediately became the league's dominant draw, that framework appears to have shaped the league's response. Keeping the brand larger than any individual player was not just a talking point, it reflected a management philosophy. When Engelbert told 60 Minutes that a league is never built around one player, she was articulating that position directly. During the same period, referees were permitted to absorb contact on Clark that went uncalled. Hits to the head, pokes to the eye, physical fouls that would have drawn immediate whistles elsewhere. The league characterized this as physicality. Critics characterized it as a policy. The rivalry framing provided useful cover. 3 formal review sessions per season now require that officiating decisions be examined in the presence of union representatives. A referee who consistently fails to call contact on high-profile players now generates a documented record. In professional employment, documented records have consequences. The officials who spent 2 seasons allowing uncalled contact on the league's most visible player are now subject to the kind of accountability that was previously applied only to the players themselves. The shift in Engelbert's public tone followed directly from the CBA's ratification. The commissioner, who had insisted no league revolves around one player, was, shortly after, describing Clark as the biggest star in the league on national radio. The change was not a recalibration of opinion, it was a recalibration of contractual reality. Once the officiating reforms were locked in, the rivalry narrative had served its purpose. Clark finished her first seasons having broken 62 records and having forced the league into structural reforms it had resisted. The 2026 season begins with officiating under formal review, directives disclosed to the union, and referees operating with the awareness that their decisions are now tracked. The conditions that allowed 2 years of uncalled contact no longer exist. What remains is a straightforward question: why did player safety require a collective bargaining agreement to enforce? The answer, embedded in the financial record and the officiating data, is not flattering to the league's prior management. The reforms are in place. Whether they hold will be visible in real time. The structural reforms embedded in the new CBA represent a departure from how the WNBA has historically managed its own accountability. But understanding why those reforms matter requires a closer look at what the old system actually produced, not just for Clark, but for the league's broader financial trajectory and its relationships with players, broadcasters, and sponsors. The free throw data was the most quantifiable evidence, but it was not the only evidence. Player tracking technology, now standard across professional basketball, captures contact events that do not result in foul calls. Across the 2024 season, independent analysts reviewing Clark's games documented a pattern. Contact initiating from defenders that met the technical threshold for a foul went uncalled at a rate measurably higher than comparable contact on other players in the same games. The league did not commission or publish that analysis. Journalists and independent researchers did. That gap between what the data showed and what the league acknowledged is itself significant. Professional sports leagues with functioning accountability structures respond to statistical anomalies with internal review. The WNBA's public posture was to attribute the pattern to competitive play and physical defense, which are not mutually exclusive with a foul call. Defense can be physical and still draw a whistle. The framing obscured that distinction. Broadcasters were in a difficult position. Rights agreements with the WNBA created commercial incentives to maintain a positive relationship with the league office. On-air analysts who raised officiating concerns directly faced the implicit risk of affecting that relationship. Some analysts did raise the issue, carefully, in the language of competitive balance rather than institutional failure. Others did not. The result was a broadcast environment that largely reflected the league's preferred framing during the period in question. The fan response was less constrained. Social media documentation of uncalled contact on Clark accumulated rapidly across platforms. Individual plays were clipped, slowed, and compared against calls made in identical situations involving other players in the same game. The volume of that documentation made the league's public position increasingly difficult to maintain. By the end of the 2024 season, the officiating question was no longer a fringe complaint. It was a mainstream sports media story. What the documentation also revealed was a secondary pattern. When Clark or the Fever's coaching staff expressed frustration on the court or in post-game press availability, the response from officials in the league office was swift. Technical fouls were issued, fines followed. The asymmetry was notable. Contact on Clark went uncalled, but reactions to that contact were penalized. The enforcement mechanism ran in one direction. Stephanie White was fined multiple times for public comments about officiating. The fines did not stop her from raising the issue, but they created a financial disincentive for coaches to be direct. Other coaches around the league observed that dynamic. The message it sent that the league would penalize criticism more reliably than it would review the underlying conduct was not lost on the broader coaching community. The Players Association had been aware of officiating concerns before Clark's arrival, but the scale of public attention that Clark generated changed the political calculus. Prior to the 2024 season, officiating grievances were handled through internal processes that produced little visible outcome. Individual players could file complaints. Those complaints went to the league office. The league office reviewed them and responded. There was no independent mechanism and no union visibility into the process or its results. The new CBA's transparency provisions directly address that structure. The requirement that the union receive the same points of emphasis materials as referees is not a symbolic gesture. Points of emphasis are the documents that tell officials what the league wants prioritized in a given season or series. They determine what gets called tightly and what gets absorbed. For years, those documents were internal. Players knew they existed. Officials referenced them in training, but the contents were not disclosed. That has now changed. The 3 annual review sessions introduce a further structural shift. The sessions are not disciplinary hearings. They are performance reviews, joint in nature, with union representatives present alongside league officials. Officiating decisions from recent games are examined. Calls and non-calls are assessed against the stated standards. Officials are aware that their work is being reviewed in that format. The awareness alone changes the incentive structure. In behavioral terms, the shift is straightforward. Under the prior system, a referee who missed a foul call on a high-profile player faced, at most, a private conversation with a supervisor. There was no paper trail accessible to anyone outside the league office, and no formal consequence attached to a pattern of misses unless the league chose to impose one. Under the new system, the same missed call enters a documented review process with union visibility. Patterns become visible to parties outside league control. The informal protection is gone. That protection had practical value for the league. Referees who enforced the unstated preference for absorbing contact on Clark without calling it were, in effect, executing a league directive. Holding them accountable for doing so would have required the league to acknowledge the directive. The closed system prevented that. Now that the system is open, the league's ability to use officiating as a management tool is structurally constrained. The commercial dimension of this story is not incidental. It is by most accounts the reason the reforms happened when they did. The WNBA's media rights negotiations in 2024 and 2025 took place against a backdrop of dramatically elevated interest in the league, driven in measurable part by Clark's presence. Amazon, NBC, and Ion Sports committed to a rights package valued at roughly $200 million annually, a figure that represented a substantial multiple of the league's prior agreements. That deal was signed with the expectation that the league's primary asset would be protected and promoted. Rights holders do not pay for access to a product that is being managed down. The broadcasters entering that agreement had financial exposure to the league's ability to deliver consistent, high-quality competition involving its most marketable players, officiating that allowed Clark to absorb uncalled contact, and that potentially shortened her availability through injury, was a liability for those agreements, not just a sports integrity question. The new rights partners were not passive in that context. Sponsor relationships carried similar weight. Clark's endorsement portfolio, which by 2025 included agreements with major national brands, created a network of commercial relationships that intersected with WNBA sponsorship. Companies with financial commitments to both Clark individually and the league institutionally had exposure to the reputational and actuarial risk of her playing in an environment with inadequate safety enforcement. That pressure was communicated, in varying degrees of directness, to the league office. The convergence of union pressure, broadcast partner expectations, sponsor relationships, and sustained public documentation created a set of incentives that the old system could not absorb. The CBA reforms were the structural response. They were not voluntary. They were the outcome of a negotiation in which the Players Association held more leverage than it had held in prior cycles, in part because the financial stakes of getting the next phase wrong were visible to everyone at the table. Clark's individual contract situation added another layer. The scale of her commercial value relative to her WNBA salary was, by the time the CBA negotiations concluded, a frequently cited illustration of the league's structural compensation problem. Her salary under the prior CBA was a fraction of the revenue her presence generated. The new CBA's improvements to maximum salaries and revenue-sharing mechanisms were not unrelated to her situation, though they applied across the roster. The Clark effect on compensation mirrored her effect on officiating accountability. Systemic change driven by the visibility her presence created. The 2026 season opens with a different physical environment on the court. Players Association reportedly prioritize contact around the perimeter and off-ball physicality, the categories that generated the most documented concern in prior seasons. Whether those emphases translate into consistent enforcement is the question that the review sessions are designed to answer in real time. The officials entering this season are aware of that structure. Referee assignments in the WNBA are made on a game-by-game basis, and assignment patterns are one of the variables that union representatives can now track across the review process. An official who generates a pattern of disputed calls in games involving specific players or specific matchups will now produce a visible record in a way that was not previously possible. The accountability is not punitive in design, but its practical effect on behavior is direct. What remains structurally unresolved is the question of the prior period, the documentation that accumulated across 2023 and 2024, the player tracking data, the free throw differentials, the filmed contact sequences, does not disappear because the CBA changed the rules going forward. Those records exist. Independent analysts have them. Journalists have them. At some point, the historical record of how the league managed officiating during Clark's first 2 seasons will be written with access to that documentation. The league's public framing during those years will be part of that record. Engelbert's tenure will be assessed in part against that history. She oversaw a period of genuine commercial growth. The media rights increase and the expansion of the league's footprint are real achievements. She also oversaw the period of officiating management that the new CBA was designed to correct. Those two facts coexist. Whether the growth would have been larger under different officiating conditions is a question the financial data can only partially answer, but it is a question the record invites. For the players entering the 2026 season, the practical change is more immediate. Veterans who spent the prior 2 seasons operating in an environment where physical play on Clark went unpunished are now operating under a different standard, one with documented enforcement and union oversight. The adjustment is behavioral. Patterns that were functionally permitted are now formally reviewed. The court is the same size, the rules are the same rules, the accountability structure is different. Clark enters the season with 62 broken records, a renegotiated commercial environment, and an officiating structure that has been reformed in direct response to conditions that developed during her first years in the league. Whether the reforms hold, whether the review sessions produce genuine accountability, and whether the points of emphasis translate into consistent calls are questions that the 2026 season will begin to answer. The mechanisms are in place, the documentation will continue, the audience is larger than it has ever been, and it is paying attention in a way that makes the prior management strategy no longer viable. The WNBA is a different institution entering this season than it was when Clark was drafted. The financial scale is larger, the broadcast commitments are more substantial, the union's visibility into league operations is greater, and the officials who take the floor in 2026 are doing so in full awareness that their work is subject to a level of review that did not exist before. That change did not happen incrementally or voluntarily. It happened because one player's presence made the cost of the old system visible enough that the parties with financial exposure to it demanded reform. The record reflects that sequence clearly.